Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944.
Hello, welcome to part 3 of Tutorial 5. This video covers several clarifications for Segment 1 of the Airborne Assault Stage, as well as examples of the drop zone procedure. Okay, first, during the Pegasus Bridge mission, if the glider unit is eliminated, it is not placed in the Commonwealth Units Eliminated box, but is instead permanently removed from the game. Its loss, however, is recorded by the Allied player using this marker on the Commonwealth Losses and Replacements track as one step of lost infantry. Second, on the airborne display, both U.S. main drop zones are referred to as LZs, or landing zones. This does not affect drop zone placement or Segment 1 in any way, but instead indicates that all units using those two drop zones land by glider in Segment 4 or on subsequent game turns. Third, during Step 3 of the drop zone placement procedure, it is possible for DZA of the 101st Airborne to scatter to the southeast into a hex containing a German unit. If this happens, there is no immediate effect. Just leave the two counters stacked together and continue with the Airborne Assault Stage. However, if you get to the end of the stage, in other words, the end of Segment 11, and DZA, or any other drop zone, still shares a hex with a German unit, permanently remove the drop zone counter from the game. Fourth, also during Step 3, it's possible for 2 or even 3 drop zones to be placed in the same hex. Drop zones T and N of the 82nd Airborne can both scatter into hex A5033, or drop zones C, D, or both can scatter into the hex containing the 101st's main drop zone, DZE. If this happens, just leave the counters stacked together and continue with the Airborne Assault Stage. Note that there's no way to move drop zone counters once they are placed in Step 3. Unless removed from the game because of a German unit, they remain in their hexes until the command phase of the June 10th AM game turn, when all drop zone counters are removed from the game. Fifth, in Step 4, when determining whether or not to apply this modifier, there only needs to be one German unit, including WN or STPs, in or adjacent to the hex the drop zone counter occupies. Additional German units do not increase the modifier. Sixth, although unlikely to be a factor in Atlantic Wall, let's clarify what qualifies as a German flak unit. According to the Gauss rules, there are two types. First, German flak units of any size and German HQ units have an anti-aircraft range of 1, so they can fire into their own and adjacent hexes. This means that the +2 modifier is applied if they are adjacent to or in the same hex as a drop zone counter. In Atlantic Wall, the other type includes German armored infantry battalions, armored recon battalions, and generic tank battalions, which have an anti-aircraft range of 0, meaning they can only fire into their own hex. In their case, the +2 modifier is not applied if a drop zone counter is placed in an adjacent hex. It is only applied if the drop zone counter is placed in the same hex. Also note that in Atlantic Wall, German armored recon battalions with 4 steps have been replaced by 2-step company errata counters that do not have organic anti-aircraft capability. Seventh, in Gauss, hexes can contain more than one type of terrain. When deciding whether or not to apply one of these modifiers to the die roll in Step 4, always use the terrain type that carries the highest possible modifier regardless of how much or how little of the terrain is found in the hex. For example, this hex contains mostly clear terrain which carries no modifier, and a small amount of woods with a modifier of +1. You would apply the +1 for the woods, regardless of how little there is. This hex contains a mix of clear, woods, and forest. The terrain with the highest modifier must be chosen, which in this case is the forest with a modifier of +2. Okay, this hex has both hedgerow, which carries no modifier, and marsh with a modifier of +1. Marsh would be chosen, and its +1 modifier applied. And finally, this hex contains hedgerow, woods, and bocage. Bocage has the highest modifier of +2, and therefore must be chosen. Note that bocage and hedgerow are very similar. Bocage is the darker of the two, and hedgerow is the lighter version of the same pattern. Okay, that's it for clarifications. Now let's look at some examples of the drop zone placement procedure. Alright, let's start with DZN, one of the UK 6th Airborne's main drop zones. For step 1, take the counter and place it in its target hex, C5418, just east of where you placed the glider Pegasus Bridge unit. For step 2, roll a 1d10 and cross-reference the number, a 7, with the column on the DZ scatter table corresponding to the 6th Airborne for a result of S1. Make a quick note of the result before moving on. For step 3, because DZN is a main drop zone, it does not scatter. Make a note of the counter's location and/or mark it on the battlefield map. Now, for step 4, because there is at least one German unit adjacent to the drop zone counter, and none of them qualify as an anti-aircraft unit, this +1 modifier will be applied. No terrain modifier is applied because there is only clear terrain in the drop zone counter's hex. Record the modifier before moving on. And finally, roll a 1d10 and add the modifier of +1 for a total of 2. Cross-reference that with the column on the DZ status table corresponding to the result from step 2, in this example an S1, and you get a drop zone status of B. Now just record the letter and move on to the next drop zone. Good, now let's look at DZV, one of the 6th Airborne's normal drop zones. First, take the counter and place it in its target hex, C5816 to the northwest of Varaville. Then roll a 1d10 and cross-reference that number with the column corresponding to the 6th Airborne for a result of S1. Make a quick note of the result. Next, go to the scatter diagram. In this example, the hex in the center of the diagram corresponds to DZV's target hex, C5816. Now, roll 2d10 and find that number, an 83, in the ranges printed in the 6 adjacent hexes. In this case, it's found one hex to the northwest. Move DZV's counter to C5716 and record and/or mark its location. Good. Next, determine the die roll modifier. There is an STP which does not qualify as an anti-aircraft unit adjacent to the drop zone counter, so a +1 modifier is applied. And the drop zone counter's hex contains woods, so an additional +1 is applied for a total of +2. Record the modifier before moving on. Finally, go to the DZ status table, roll a 1d10, add the modifier to the roll of 3 for a total of 5. Cross-reference that with the column corresponding to the result from the DZ scatter table, in this case an S1, for a drop zone status of C. Then just record that letter and move on to the next drop zone. Now, just to help with step 4, here are the modifiers for the 7 possible hexes that DZV could be placed in. Alright, now let's look at DZW, the US 82nd Airborne's main drop zone. Take the counter and place it in its target hex, A5734, south of St. Mary-Eglise. Roll a 1d10 and cross-reference that number, a 6, with the column corresponding to the 82nd Airborne for a result of S2, and make a quick note of the result. Next, the counter remains in its target hex because DZW is a main drop zone. Record and/or mark its location. Good. Now there is no modifier for step 4 because there are no German units in or adjacent to the counter, and because its hex contains a mix of clear and hedgerow terrain, neither of which carries a modifier. So record a modifier of 0. Then just roll a 1d10 and cross-reference the number, a 4, with the S2 column for a status of D. Finally, to finish up DZW, record that letter. Good. Now let's continue with DZT, one of the 82nd's normal drop zones. Place the counter in its target hex, A5032, southwest of Amfreville. Roll a 1d10 and cross-reference the number with the column for the 82nd for a result of NS, and make a quick note of the result. Leave the counter in its hex. A result of NS means no scatter. Record and/or mark its location. As there are no German units in or adjacent to the drop zone, and its hex only contains hedgerow, there will be no modifier. So record a 0. Finally, roll a 1d10 and cross-reference the unmodified number with the NS column for a status of A. Record the letter and continue to the next DZ. And here are the possible modifiers for the 7 hexes DZT could be placed in. Okay, for the final example, let's look at DZA, one of the US 101st Airborne's normal drop zones. Place the counter in its target hex, A5831, between St. Mary-Eglise and Utah Beach. Roll a 1d10 and cross-reference the number with the column corresponding to the 101st for a result of S2. Make a quick note of the result, then go to the scatter diagram. Roll 2d10 and look for the number, a 33. It's found 1 hex to the southeast, so move DZA to A5931, stack it with the German unit there, and record and/or mark the drop zone's location. Next, the modifier will be a +1 because there is at least 1 German unit in or adjacent to the drop zone counter, and because the hedgerow terrain in its hex does not carry a modifier. Record the modifier before moving on. Okay, now roll a 1d10, add the modifier to that number, and cross-reference the total of 8 with the S2 column for a status of E. Finally, record that letter. Okay, that's everything for segment 1. As always, if you have a comment or notice a mistake, please let me know. Any and all feedback is appreciated. So, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.